Okay, so I'll share the screen again. Yeah, no, okay, so we'll take turns then. I'll try and get people who haven't spoken yet to go, and we'll sort of do a rough overview of the story of the Mahabharata leading up to today. Well, not leading up to today, leading up to the Bhagavad-Gita. Okay, so Nandan Prabhu, though, seeing as you asked about Adi Parva, do you want to start the story somewhere?
I said Adi Parva because that's all I know, really.
Oh, okay.
But I can understand from the start of it was is his name Vichitravirya, was a king of India at one point, and he passes away, and his sons were meant to inherit the throne, but his sons are Pandu and Dhritarashtra. If I go on Pandu, but Bhishma.
Oh no, it is Dhritarashtra. What am I saying? Yeah. No, it is.
But Pandu inherits the throne, but dies, and so Dhritarashtra gets the throne. But Pandu has 5 children, which is the Pandavas. I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, very good.
A mess of it.
Yeah. No, you've got it. Why does Pandu die? Who can tell me? Someone else.
Because he was when he was born, he wasn't born healthy, so he was quite sick, I think.
Yeah. No. There's a bit more pastime.
Yeah.
Probably he had a curse.
I think Jaswanath Prabhu was first.
Oh, Hare Krishna Prabhu. He had a curse.
Yeah. Yes, and what was the curse? Okay, then Tarun Prabhu maybe can jump in. What was the curse? Tarun Prabhu, I think you were saying something. You unmuted. Yeah.
Yes, Prabhu, he accidentally shot an arrow which killed both the Rishi and his wife. And while they were dying, he got that curse that if he sort of try to go sort of near a woman, then he will have the same fate. He will die.
Yeah. And then he ended up doing exactly that, right? Yeah, and then he died.
Yeah.
Shows the power of lust, right? Even if you know it's going to kill you, they'll still do it. So yeah, okay, yes. So that's how Pandu died. Very good. So after Pandu dies, what happens with the relationship between Dhritarashtra, the surviving brother, and the Pandavas, Pandu's sons?
Prabhu, by that time, when several years had passed and Shakuni was there, he has already sort of brainwashed their to that they are the sort of rightful sons and whatnot. He planted the seeds of the trouble long before, and by the time the Pandu's son came back, I think Bhishma went to bring them back. The relationship between them was really not smooth. I think they got that the Acharya, what was his name, for education not long after. Like they tried to kill the Pandavas as well many times.
Yes.
But the Pandavas were getting, each time they will try something, they will come out stronger. And that cycle repeated again and again and again a few times.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, we'll cut it there so that we can, but yes, very good, very good. So they really didn't like each other. And so the children of Dhritarashtra kept on trying to kill the Pandavas. We can go into a lot of detail of how they tried to do that. Galaxy S10 had their hand raised. Galaxy S10 Prabhu, Who are you? Sorry, just because your camera is off, I have no idea who you are.
Sorry, Prabhu, it's Vidhi. I don't know
Oh,
why.
okay, yes, okay, Vidhi Mataji.
Mobile's name and not my name.
Yeah, okay,
Sorry
then.
about that. I've logged in from my mobile, actually. My
Yes.
laptop's discharged completely. I just wanted to take a step back on what everybody said, a little bit of, a little back. So Dhritarashtra was actually the oldest son, and he was supposed to be the king, but because he was born blind and he was not worthy, physically not up to the mark to be the king, therefore Pandu was made the king. And he always harbored this resentment towards, everyone, and especially the family, that, I was not made the king, but I am the right heir to the throne. And he sort of passed it down to his sons also. So when the Pandavas came back, because Pandu was the king, so his sons should have taken the throne. But because Dhritarashtra was the eldest son, he passed this thing down to his sons that, they should be they are the rightful heirs to the throne. And that's where the animosity between the Pandavas and the Kauravas started. And they always tried to, kill them even during their childhood and right up to the time the Mahabharata happened.
Yes, very nice. There we go. We've got Dhritarashtra. And Prabhupada has a great purport in first chapter of Bhagavad-Gita where he says, oh, wait. And I'm forgetting if it's Gita or Bhagavatam. I'm pretty sure it's Gita, where he says that not only was Dhritarashtra materially blind, but even worse, he was spiritually blind as well.
Right.
Yeah, very nice. Okay, so then now pulling us back, and then Tarun Prabhu's very nicely told us up until, the childhood affairs of them trying to, the children trying to kill the Pandavas. How many children did Dhritarashtra have?
100.
100?
100, yeah. 100 for sure. Rohan Prabhu, do you want to tell us the pastime of how he has 100 children? 101, yeah.
I can't really remember like how he got that boon, but I remember that when Gandhari, she was pregnant, like the stomach was very big, and like when it came out, it was just like a big bowl of flesh. And I don't know who did it, but it was like separated and then put into like clay containers or something. And that's what caused the 100 children to grow.
Yeah. Yeah, no, she gets angry and then she tries to induce a miscarriage. Yes. And that's why the fetus comes out not fully formed. Katyayani Mataji and Srinivas Prabhu, you've raised your hand.
So it was Vyasadeva, he actually divides that flesh into 100 parts. And I'm not sure whether, so they say, I heard somewhere like 100 sons and there is one daughter as well. So he divides that flesh into the portions, and then, so it's like a kind of, we can relate it to a test tube method today. So the fetuses are grown, and then finally the 100 sons and one daughter comes out.
Yeah, for sure.
And mainly because it happened since Yudhishthira was born initially under Bhima, and then Gandhari was very frustrated because she's still carrying, and then in the frustration she tried to abort the child, and then the fetus came out of her womb, and then this is all happened at the time. That's what probably.
Okay. Very nice, very nice. So like that now, I'll just recap because we've told the story in like not even a reverse order. We've if there's it's some just in a complete puzzled order. So we began with we won't go at the very beginning, but we began with the two brothers Pandu and Dhritarashtra. Pandu he accidentally kills the sages while they're in the form of a deer. Then they curse him. If you ever try to have any intimate relations with your wife, then you're dead. He decides it's worth it, and then he dies. And then we have Dhritarashtra, his brother, who was always jealous because he was meant to get the throne, but he was blind, so he wasn't able to inherit it. And he's got many children, right? Because his wife she tried to, induce a miscarriage, and then Vyasadeva advised her to, split it up and then get the 100 sons and the daughter. Okay, so now we've got these two families side by side. We've got the Pandavas, the sons of Pandu, and then we've got the 101 children, coming from Dhritarashtra's side. So like this, the two sides are there, and obviously Dhritarashtra's side, they inherited from their father the dislike of the Pandavas, and so they tried to kill them a lot, right? So that's our build up so far. Now I think from now, just for the sake of time, because Mahabharat's so big, we can go on for a while. What eventually happens that kicks them out? Maybe we can get Varun Prabhu. Varun Prabhu, actually, I bow down to his lotus feet in terms of Mahabharat knowledge. Varun has a big love for the Mahabharat. So I put him on the spot now. But what happens then? Just give us a quick trajectory of after they got kicked out, and or how they got exiled, and how that builds up to the war.
So from what I can remember, the only thing I can remember from like how far I go back is with the dice game.
Yeah.
And from then that happens, and then they get exiled. I forgot why did they get exiled again?
Because they lose the dice game.
Yeah, they lose the dice game. They get exiled. They have to live in incognito. After that, it's quite a blur for me, to be honest, because I read it a while ago. But after that, they get into a few fights. I can't exactly remember how the war actually happened. Put me on the spot, but
no, that's good. That's what I wanted. I just wanted, so they go out in exile because of that, and then now that they're in exile, very good, because of the dice game.
how do they?
Yes,
Yeah.
Vidhi Mataji, and then how do we get from the dice game to the war? I mean, from the exile to the war.
So even the Draupadi Chirharan happens during the dice game, and that's when Draupadi is offended and everything. So when Pandavas go into exile, they fulfill the conditions of all the exile, and when they come back, they ask for their throne, basically. So because they are Kshatriyas, they have to rule. So they ask that we fulfill the conditions, and rightfully Yudhishthira, being the eldest son, should get the throne. And that's when Duryodhan refuses to give them the throne. And although he's given many options that, he can also give 5 villages to the Pandavas so that they can rule because they are Kshatriyas, but he refuses to give them anything. And he makes a comment that he will not give them a land even as small as the tip of a needle. So that's what leads to the war, because ideally, rightfully, Pandavas should have ruled, and they were not given a kingdom to rule.
Jai. Very good, very good. Okay, and then all of that leads up. I think that's enough context. We can go, as I said, we can go on for a while. The Mahabharata lives up to the Mahabharata of its name, and it's a pretty long text. So we've got the general idea, right? So there's these two armies coming together. They're related. They dislike each other from before. The Pandavas are the sons of Pandu. The Kauravas are coming from Dhritarashtra, like that. And this is how they're meeting together on the battlefield. So I just wanted to establish that general narrative so it's fresh in everyone's mind. Is everyone's feeling the trajectory of the Bhagavad-Gita, right? So now we're about to hear the battle's about to begin, right? Okay, so we will continue that train of thought next week when we start the first chapter. So before we do that, though, we will just quickly talk about the introduction itself, which most of you read. Here, just out of curiosity, before we touch on the points, just a little breakdown of the introduction that I thought was of points that were important. How did everyone find reading the introduction? What are some people's realizations or like perspectives? What did people get out of reading the introduction?
Sorry, I didn't raise my hand, but Prabhu, I found it quite, because I found the context, because Prabhupada's introducing Bhagavad-Gita to basically the Western world for the first time in a very complete manner. And the way in which the introduction goes is literally on the 3rd page, he's already talking about the soul and its relationship with Krishna in its 5 categories. And I found that, having been involved in Western outreach, that's not something you tell to someone straight away. Hey, you could be a friend of Krishna or a lover of Krishna. But Prabhupada really cuts to the chase quite quickly. And I found that very, very inspiring, actually, that he had such firm faith in his presentation that he could go straight to the source of the issue.
Yeah. It reminds me, once I was on book distribution, you really have to have the potency of Srila Prabhupada to pull that off, because I remember I was doing book distribution once a bit. We stopped this on Mataji, and I was just doing the classic, Bhagavad-Gītā as a yoga text line, which when we continue Bhakti-śāstrī, we will know it is very much a yoga text. But I was saying, sort of going off on the, you do yoga, she does some hatha yoga, right? So I said, this is very good for you to read. And then she said, oh, I'm a Christian. I don't really want to read another religious book. And I said, no, this is very, spiritual. It's all about yoga. Don't worry. Just take it. I was trying to get it across. And then she said, okay, I'll take it. And then the devotee I was doing book distribution with, he was like, just open a page and read. You'll find that it's not religious at all, right? And there I was, and I was just praying to Krishna. I was thinking, open up to something like, the mind is the best, the untamed mind is the worst enemy and the tamed mind is the best friend, something like that. Please open it. She opens it, and she opens up, Brahma has created all of the million species in the universe. And Krishna is the supreme personality of God. It was like one of those really intense purports. And she was like, oh, I don't know, this sounds pretty religious to me. She still ended up taking the book because I just sort of refused to take it back. But still, she definitely, I didn't really have that experience. So you really have to have Prabhupada potency to pull that off. But it's amazing that he managed to pull that off, right? Especially in the context he was in, where people weren't at all, anything Eastern was weird, right? In that sort of historical context. Yeah, anything else that struck out to anyone?
So compacted, there's so much knowledge, so much realization. I mean, every time I read the introduction, I learn different things every time I reread the introduction. So yeah, it was just amazing. One of the things really, yet again, I read it and how Prabhupada describes in a very simple, plain English, how Bhagavad-Gita, the whole Sanatana Dharma is non-sectarian. He explains in a very simplified way, so that was quite inspiring to me yet again.
Yeah, for sure. And I especially like that point because I'll touch on it in a later slide, but I may as well touch on it now. How Prabhupada, he lists what Sanatana Dharma is, all of the dharmas that are not Sanatana Dharma. And what does he list? He lists Christianity, he lists Buddhism, but he also lists Hinduism, right? Because actually Prabhupada's making this point that Krishna consciousness is completely non-sectarian because Krishna consciousness is Sanatan, it's eternal, right? It's not based on any identification of the body. If it can be changed, it's not Sanatana Dharma, right? And one day somebody can say, I'm a Hindu, and the next day they can say, I'm a Muslim. And then somebody can one day say, I'm a Muslim, and the next day they can say, well, I'm a Hindu, right? And then the next day they can say, I'm a Christian. They can say all of these things, right? But that can't be Sanatana Dharma because it's Sanatan. It's not eternal. What is eternal? The spirit soul is eternal. The supreme personality of Godhead is eternal. Bhakti is eternal. Love for Godhead is eternal, right? So much people sometimes get attached. The word is upadhi, right? Designation. They get attached to designations, right? And Prabhupada is completely cutting through. So many people who identify with Krishna consciousness will identify as a Hindu, and that's fine, right? There's no problem with doing that, right? But that's not actually the eternal designation. That's just some temporary thing. Bhaktivinoda Thakur would give the description of Haridas Thakur. He would say Haridas Thakur was not a Hindu, but he was the greatest of Vaishnavas, right? Because he was practicing Sanatana Dharma, right? He was practicing Krishna consciousness. So yeah, it's a very important point that actually it's non-sectarian in any way. Because the moment you put an identification on that's temporary, you're talking about your body. You're talking about all sorts of other things. You're not talking about all of these sort of things. And people will do this often also with ISKCON. They'll say, I'm an ISKCON member. And they'll think that makes them a pure devotee, right? Just identifying with ISKCON doesn't make you a pure devotee. ISKCON is useful in so much as it makes you a pure devotee, right? But again, people will do this and they'll say, oh, but ISKCON is Krishna consciousness, therefore I'm not doing the same trick. But they're falling into the same trap. They're identifying with something and they're saying, therefore all done and dusted, right? But that's not Sanatan, right? Because I can be an ISKCON member today and technically I could become and not stop being an ISKCON member tomorrow. But at no point do I ever stop being a spirit soul whose constitutional position, whose inherent highest dharma is to love Krishna. So yeah, I think that's a very important point. That's one of the big points that I took away as well from the introduction. Any other points?
Hare Krishna Prabhu.
Yes.
So the one point that stuck into my mind was, so this knowledge is eternal. It's not like Lord Krishna spoke this message in the battlefield of Kurukshetra to Arjuna, but it was also mentioned in the 4th chapter beginning. So this knowledge was given to the sun god Vivaswan. So that confirms this knowledge is eternal. It's not something spoken like 5,000 years ago.
Yes,
Comes
very nice.
in Parampara system.
I was thinking when you read the introduction, if you were to count, I don't know how many times Sanatan is mentioned, but it's mentioned a lot of times. Like it's stressed a lot, right? And exactly to your point, the parampara is that old. Although that parampara is broken, Prabhupada does write in the introduction, by speaking as Bhagavad-Gītā, Krishna has actually created a new parampara with Arjuna, which I've always found an interesting point that Prabhupada says. But yes, that knowledge itself is very ancient. Mrunal and Shivam, both of you, I know you read the introduction, but you've been a little silent.
Okay. So from my side, there's the 5 things that actually came up to me. First time I read this one. So how it mentions, Bhagavad-Gita talks about Ishvara, Jiva, Prakriti, the karma, and also Kala, and how karma is made out of all the 3 modes of material nature, and also how time plays along. And out of all of this, karma is not eternal because it can be changed through our bhakti and everything. So that's one point which I actually liked.
Yes, no, that's a great point. And just for all of the nerdier people here, that point was actually taken from Baladev Vidyabhushan's introduction to the Bhagavad-Gita. So again, we're seeing how Prabhupada, he's working so well with the previous acharyas. The five topics is actually something Baladev Vidyabhushan he brings up. He also mentions it in his Ishopanishad commentary. And also interesting, I haven't verified this myself, but I've heard from senior devotees that Baladev Vidyabhushan got that from Madhva Acharya. So it shows how much in conversation with the parampara, with the tradition, all of these books are. They're not some new thing that Prabhupada just pulled out of nowhere, right? This is an ancient and respectable source of wisdom and tradition. Very nice. And Shri Mataji, I also know you read it and you haven't heard.
Yeah. What I found interesting was like Srila Prabhupada so simply put like the purpose of the Bhagavad-Gita, what it is. It's like to like connect with Krishna and always like think about him. So that was like, oh wow, like that's what I should be like aiming for when I'm reading Bhagavad-Gita and even after.
Yeah, for sure. Very nice. Very nice. So I'll touch on a few points from the introduction and then we'll probably wrap up there. I won't have time to discuss the preface, but that's all right. The preface is only a few minutes. And the main reason I'm discussing it is it's one of your potential OBA questions. But we'll touch upon that next week realistically. So the introduction, first thing, the paragraph that really sticks out to me every single time is this section. Because I really think this section here just summarizes not just the message of the Bhagavad-Gita, but the message of Krishna consciousness in general. For me, if you can understand anything from the introduction, I think if you understand this, you'll be comfortable in the Bhagavad-Gita as it is and in Krishna conscious philosophy in general. Alex, would you like to read it out?
Sure. Bhagavad-Gita as it is intro. What is this consciousness? This consciousness is I am. Then what am I? In contaminated consciousness, I am means I am the Lord of all I survey. I am the enjoyer. The world revolves because every living being thinks that he is the Lord and creator of the material world. Material consciousness has two psychic divisions. One is that I am the creator, the other is that I am the enjoyer. But actually, the Supreme Lord is both the creator and the enjoyer, and the living entity, being part and parcel of the Supreme Lord. He is neither the creator nor the enjoyer, but a cooperator. He is the created and the enjoyed.
Jai. So here we're having a clear point that there are just two categories of beings, right? There are those that enjoy and there are those that are enjoyed, right? There are those that accept service and there are those that give service. And what is our problem in this material world? Our problem is that we are confused about which one we are. The consciousness that accepts service is the Vibhu Chaitanya, the grand consciousness, the large consciousness, the infinite consciousness, which is Krishna, right? Krishna is the enjoyer. We hear this all the time, but it is such a deep and profound point. Why? Because we are not the enjoyer. We are Anu Chaitanya, small consciousness, which is meant to be enjoyed by Krishna, which is meant to give itself up in service to Krishna. And that is the essential disease, the essential problem that we are addressing in material life. We are meant to serve, but instead we are demanding to be served. If we understand this, we understand the whole trajectory of the Bhagavad-Gītā. We understand the whole trajectory of Krishna consciousness. Because what is Krishna consciousness? It is transforming that desire to be served into a desire to serve. And therefore, it is bringing people into their position where there is no more suffering. I often am reminded when I think of this point of there's a parable that's given in the Jewish tradition. It came up in around the Middle Ages. It's one of those stories where no one knows who was the first one to say it, but we know it was somewhere around in Middle Ages Jewry. And it's called the parable of the spoons. And it says that hell is a place where there is a grand feast and everyone is feasting at this table, right? And the feast is wonderful. There's all of the food you can imagine, right? All of them as wonderful items. And everyone is trying to eat this food, right? And they've got these long spoons. And the spoons are so long that they can't actually get the spoon to go into their mouth, right? You can imagine if you have a very, very long spoon, you can maybe get the food in the spoon, but when you try and fit it into your mouth, it's just too long, right? And so everyone is tortured because they're seeing the best food they've ever seen in their life. And it's all laid out in front of them. They've got these long spoons, right? And they've got the food on the spoon. It's so close and they just can't get it into their mouth. That's what hell is described as like. And then they say, what is heaven? Heaven, on the other hand, is the same table filled with all of that food, right? And the same long spoons. But when each person takes the long spoon, they take the long spoon and put the food into somebody else's mouth and they feed each other, right? So all those same materials are there, but they instead have learned simply to stop trying to exploit things for their own pleasure to serve themselves, but instead to serve others, right? To act in service, one will have the greatest feelings of satisfaction and happiness because that is the constitutional position of the small bits of consciousness that we are, right? So this point here, again, I just think this is if we take away one thing from the introduction, this is really summarizing all of it. This is the Krishna conscious process, right? Anyways, we'll go into a little further detail. So first, oh no, okay, I've accidentally put Apurusheya there. Then I'll just put them all out. So we've got epistemology first. So the Bhagavad-Gītā as it is introduction covers a whole philosophy. Again, don't worry, I'll put these slides up into the group because there's a lot of like note taking that needs to be done from these slides. Again, you don't need to memorize these, but knowing at least the English is important. You don't need to remember the Sanskrit, but please memorize at least the English. Epistemology is the English word for the study of how do we know things. What can we know? What do we know, right? So Srila Prabhupada, he very nicely gives us an epistemology in the Bhagavad-Gītā as it is. What can we know? How can we know it? And what can't we know? And what he gives, I've just color-coded so it's easier to distinguish. The first four are the nature of material knowledge. And the last one, the orange one, is the nature of spiritual knowledge. So the point is, we have these 4 faults of material knowledge. What is material knowledge? It's any knowledge that we get from our senses and from logic, right? They all have these 4 faults. Now, sometimes people misunderstand this and they think we're saying some sort of culty brainwashing thing. Don't trust your senses, don't trust your mind. Whatever you think, whatever you see, it's not true. Just believe what I say. We're not saying that the senses can't give knowledge, and we're not saying that your senses are evil and must be chucked out, right? The point is that the senses are inherently imperfect, and you will never get perfect knowledge from them, right? The point isn't that your senses are useless, chuck them out, and just listen to whatever you're told, right? Because, well, otherwise we wouldn't mention the others as sources of knowledge at all, right? They are sources of knowledge, they're just not perfect sources of knowledge. So Srila Prabhupada, he lists these 4. Again, I would note the English of these. These may or may not come up in your closed book exam. So, the 4 mistakes, I'm sure they're pretty self-explanatory. Brahma just means, we can make mistakes, right? Even if you get all the perfect information, you can say the wrong thing, right? Sometimes you call your teacher mom, right? It's like that, right? No matter what you do, you're just going to make a mistake, even if you've got the right data. Your teacher is not your mother, right? But you just go out and you just say, "Hey, mom," and then you're embarrassed. You're the clown of today. Okay, pramada, right? Inattention. Anyone who's ever tried to chant more than 1 round, I don't think I need to explain anymore, right? It's really hard to focus, right? So sometimes we just zone out. Okay. Vipralipsa has a tendency to cheat others. Again, like if you follow politics, if you just see the way the world is, if it's financially desirable to deny that we have any impact on the environment, then, oh, look, woe and behold, here's a scientific research showing that actually carbon emissions are good for the environment, right? Or we can take a look 50, 70, 80 years ago, right? The cigarette companies, they funded a lot of research which showed that actually smoking, far from causing lung cancer, actually prevents it, right? So people aren't exactly honest with the knowledge they give, right? So there's another fault, right? There's that propensity, that ability to cheat, right? Even if all the other ones don't kick in. And then there is limited senses, right? That's pretty straightforward. Norm Macdonald, he's a comedian who recently passed away. And he had a little bit that he would often say where he says he doesn't believe in DNA. And of course, everyone would just be like, well, what are you talking about? You don't believe in DNA. And he says, point at it. I've never seen DNA in my life before. Why should I believe it exists? And of course, he's sort of like, doing it just in jest. But the point is valid, right? Our senses can't see DNA. We can't see infrared light. We can't see all of these things. There's so many things that we need all of these machines to adjust our senses because our senses are imperfect, right? If anyone's been sleep deprived enough, you'll straight up start hallucinating. That shows that our senses are far from these perfect vessels of knowledge that we like to think they are, right? So there we find, these are the 4 faults which essentially prevent us from having perfect knowledge, right? We can obtain knowledge, right? But it's never going to be perfect because inherently the means by which we get them are imperfect. As it says in the Bible, one cannot bring a clean thing out of an unclean thing, right? However, we contrast this against the Vedic knowledge. We contrast this against the Vedic knowledge, which is aparusheya. Aparusheya means not from a person, not from a man, right? If we could get it, it's actually really nicely constructed in Sanskrit. Parusheya means from purush, and then just means not. So not from a person, right? Because the Veda, as we've discussed it, Vedic knowledge is coming from Krishna, right? It is the breathing of Narayan, or it's coming from the meditation of the sages on Krishna, right? So this is something which is coming not from these sources, but instead from a spiritual source. And therefore, we understand in our epistemology, again, I think sometimes devotees abuse this. They'll say, don't think about logic, don't think about your senses, right? This is not a healthy way to think, right? This is just straight up unhealthy. But we should realize that the Vedas are coming from a platform that is perfect. And therefore, we put the Vedas at the highest level of authority. That doesn't mean we don't give authority to our senses and logic. Again, I don't want anyone to get into psychologically unhealthy habits by denying their senses and their mind, right? So, yeah. So this is our epistemology. This is how we can know things, right? Of course, we can go much more into detail with this, but I don't want to do information overload. There's already a lot more information than I normally want from a session in today. Next, we go on to the 3 general topics that are always given when we understand anything. So the 3 general topics are sambandha, abhidheya, prayojana. It is the relationships, the process, and the destination. So sambandha, this means the relationships. And as Mrunal Mataji very nicely told us, there are these 5 general categories that are given. There's Ishvara, the Supreme Lord. There is Jiva, the living entity. There's Prakriti, the material world. And there's Kala, which is time. And then there is Karma, which is, oh, I wrote Karma a second time. It's meant to say work. Okay, I'll modify that before I send the slides out. So there are these 5 categories. And as I said, we can find these in Baladev Vidyabhushan's commentary. So this is Sambandha. Sambandha means relationship. And it means what is the nature of the world. If we want to use another fancy English word, you could say this is ontology. This is, what is this world we're in? What is the nature of the world we're in? And the reason why we express it in terms of relationship is because inherently the way the things relate is the way the world works, right? And it's pretty straightforward. Ishvara is the controller. The controller produces us, the jivas, right? It also produces Prakriti. Prakriti needs a controller, right? The material world without a living being in it is dead, right? Nothing happens. It's dravya, it's dead. Nothing happens in a material world where there isn't a controller. We have the big controller, which is Ishvara, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and we have the tiny controllers, who are us, the living entities, right? So here we have the relationship. The big controller controls, or ideally controls, the small controllers, right? These are all relating. However, no control makes any sense with Prakriti, right? It doesn't make any sense for the material world to be controlled if there isn't any time, right? For that control to be acted out in. And therefore we have time. How does time relate to all of these? Time allows all of these to happen, right? Without time, these relationships are meaningless, right? And then we have karma. Karma is what is done when the jiva controlling Prakriti with the enabled by time, they are able to do action like this. Time is also interesting because time is what facilitates anything to be eternal, which is a point Srila Prabhupada makes. 4 of these are eternal and 1 of these are not. They are only able to be eternal by the existence of time, right? And the one that is not is only able to be non-eternal by the existence of time. Shri Mataji, not to put you on the spot, but which one of these is not eternal? Do you remember? It's all right if you don't. Prabhupada mentions it in 1 line in the introduction.
Karma?
Karma? Yes. Karma is not eternal, right? Because karma, meaning the fruits of actions or just the activities themselves, they come to an end, right? However, an interesting point that Baladev Vidyabhushan makes is karma actually is eternal in one direction. Karma has always existed, but it will eventually come to an end. So Baladev Vidyabhushan says karma is anadi, right? It is originless, right? So while the other ones are sanatan, they are eternal, backwards and forth. You will never have a point where the Supreme Lord, where God stops existing, right? And there never was a point where he didn't exist. With karma, karma is eternal backwards, right? But it is, it can come to a conclusion, and hopefully in all of our cases, it eventually will come to a conclusion. How you can understand that, that's a bit too much of a tangent. Maybe I'll mention it next week, or if we have slight bit of time at the end of today. Baladev Vidyabhushan gives a really nice analogy how we can understand originlessness. Okay, so we have the nature of the world. Next in the purport, in the order Prabhupada goes in, he mentions the goal. And we've already touched upon this, so I won't talk about it much. Sanatan, right? Sanatan, Sanatan, Sanatan. If I did a Control F just to find a quote, the not Hindu quote, and you just have this whole cluster where it's practically all highlighted. There's just these 3 paragraphs of Prabhupada's just going Sanatan, Sanatan, Sanatan. He lists these sort of things. You don't need to note these down, but I think they're nice to get an overview, right? These aren't even in the question bank, but they're still important to understand. So everything is eternal. And Prabhupada's making this point that the goal of our existence, prayojana means the goal, the final aspiration, the destination, it's eternal because we are eternal, right? So in order for something to match us, it must be eternal. And therefore, we have the Sanatan Dham, right? The eternal sky. This is the eternal destination, the spiritual world, right? And in it, it has the eternal Supreme Lord. And in it, it also has the eternal living entities. And what is practiced there? Again, the point we were making earlier, not the asanatan, not the temporary identifications, right? Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, right? It is just that natural function of the soul, right? To love God, to love the Supreme Person. So we already touched upon this before. Just a slight note, who knows where the word Hindu came from? Nandan has raised his hand.
From the opposite side of the Sindhu River, you had the Mohammedans who would, in their accent, say Sindhu, Sindhu, to say Hindu. Funnily enough, the word in Russian, in the Russian language, to say Hindu, they say Sindhu.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. What's interesting is even though it got introduced to India under the Muslims, but we can actually find records of the word Hindu being used in pre-Islamic Iran. You can find like these old carvings into walls, but for exactly the reason you said. They had an accent and they couldn't pronounce Sindhu, so they said Hindu. So the word Hindu in its origin actually just meant just the people in the subcontinent of India, right? It only much later on became a religious designation. Before, it just generally meant that area, right? You would find in some history books, you'll find mentions of Muslims who would go on Hajj to Arabia, the pilgrimage, the Muslim pilgrimage, and they would say we are Hindu Muslims because they meant we are just from the area, the Hindu area. Of course, later on, it's become a religious concept. What's also interesting, and this is just a total side note, is that the word India actually comes from the same word. The word India is the Greek way of pronouncing Hindu. So the Greeks heard the word Hindu from the Persians, and then they would pronounce it Indos, right? And then from Indos, they would say India, and then it's a long story. Then India gets into Latin, and then from Latin, it gets into English. So just interesting about how India and Hindu, these both words are just developments of describing all these people around a certain river. Just interesting, I find. A little tangential, but I find an interesting historical note. Yes, Vivekananda is really the first who sort of uses it to talk about this unified religious tradition. Okay, so the prayojana, right? So we've heard what is the relationship between us and the world now. We've heard what is our goal and destination. And Prabhupada, he ends the introduction, or rather before he concludes the introduction, he describes the abhidheya. How do we get from the sambandha, the way things are now, the relationships we have now, to the prayojana, to the goal? How do we get there? We get there with the abhidheya of Krishna consciousness. Mrugank Prabhu, you have a nectarian voice. Do you want to recite the shloka for us?
Sure. Abhyasa yoga yuktena chetasa nanya paramam purusham divyam yati parthanu chintayan.
And Vignaraj Prabhu, are you there?
Yeah.
Do you want to read the English?
Yeah, sure. He who meditates on me as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, his mind constantly engaged in remembering me, undeviated from the path, he, O Arjuna, is sure to reach me.
Jai. Very nice. So here, Prabhupada at the end, what does he say? He actually quotes a lot of shlokas, but this one I thought was the one that most cut to the chase. He said, how then do we reach this destination, right? How do we activate this Sanatana Dharma, or rather act within this Sanatana Dharma? How do we reach the Sanatana sky? How do we reach this destination? How do we go back home, back to Godhead? It is by always remembering Krishna, right? It is about constantly meditating on Krishna. Prabhupada, he gives a very nice analogy. And by totally falling in love with Krishna, we can always remember Krishna. And then we can go back to Krishna, right? By fully falling in love with him. In the same way, Prabhupada gives a rather intense example of a wife who's an adulterous wife, right? Even though she's serving her husband, right? She's always thinking of the other partner, right? A rather risque analogy Prabhupada is giving. But what's the point he's making, right? In the same way, we might be existing in this material world. We might be acting within it, but we should always be just thinking of Krishna, not in a forced way. Again, we shouldn't be psychologically unhealthy, right? We shouldn't be unhealthy people. But by falling in love with Krishna, naturally that remembrance will come, right? So naturally, by learning about Krishna, by hearing about Krishna, by chanting Krishna's holy names, we'll fall more and more in love with Krishna. And just in the same way, we will constantly be thinking about Krishna. So in this way, in Krishna consciousness, this is the way we can get there. I'm thinking we will touch on this slide maybe next week. Yeah, and then the preface and questions. Okay, so I'll just make a few, before I make a few more points, I'll just ask for any questions, because all of the other points I can make next week. I'll open it up to some questions, and yeah. If there's no questions, then I'll make a few other points. But Nandan, is your hand raised for a question, or did you forget to lower it?
It wasn't, but I do have one.
Okay, please go ahead.
Just on the point of epistemology, with the tendency to make mistakes and all four of them in Apurusheya.
Yeah.
When we talk about how all of the Shrutis and all the commentaries, they are an interpretation, whether you like it or not, everything requires some kind of interpretation to understand.
Yeah.
How can we understand the acharyas as being those who are not affected by these four defects, and how do they come to that position? I just find sometimes I kind of doubt. That's the doubt within my heart.
Yeah, it's because when we talk about epistemology, we're talking about knowledge coming in, right? So knowledge comes in through our senses, right? It comes in through this filter of the material body, right? So it's coming in through our senses, and then we're interpreting it through logic, right? However, the realizations of the acharyas is not coming through their senses. It's coming through the devotion they feel within their soul, right? So it's coming from their soul, right? And then, yes, it's being expressed through their bodies, which also technically aren't material, but we'll touch upon that as we get deeper into the Bhagavad-Gītā. But it's the source of the knowledge is not through those things. The source of their knowledge is from the spiritual platform, and therefore it's untouched by those things. Do you get what I'm saying? It's not that they've received that knowledge through those means. They've received it through a spiritual platform, and therefore it's not limited. The epistemological biases are a filter, right? But they're not taking that knowledge through that filter. Does that answer your question?
That's a very nice answer. Thanks for reading it. That's quite good. Thank you.
Rohan Prabhu?
Yeah. I just had one question while I was reading the introduction.
Yeah.
So it says that the superior prakriti is known as the living entity, the jiva. Like, how does that relate to like the jiva being a like spiritual object, being like Satchitananda? Yeah.
So it's a little bit confusing, because at times it depends how we split up the categories. At times we'll hear that the jiva is the internal potency of the Lord, right? Other times we'll hear it's the marginal potency. We'll never actually hear that it's the external potency, but sometimes it just gets categorized with prakriti. My understanding why it's categorized as prakriti in that situation is because it's talking about all of the jivas that are embodied in the material world. When the material world is manifested, it's filled with jivas, right? It's filled with spirit souls. And therefore they are part of the manifestation of the material world, right? None of the material world would develop without the jivas within it. So sometimes we can categorize the jivas as part of that that prakriti, right? In that sense. But the reason why they're then divided is also because they are still energies of Krishna, right? So the external energy and the marginal energy, they're both still Krishna's energies, right? So you can lump them together because they are categorically both energy, right? There's a material energy and then there's the energy of the spirit souls. And because the spirit souls are, as you said, fragments of Satchidananda, therefore they're higher than the material energy and therefore they're a superior prakriti. Those are two different ways you can sort of approach that.
That's great. Thank you.
Jai. Any other questions I'm seeing in the chat? There's one question. If we are the enjoyed, not the enjoyer, does that mean we cannot be happy? Because if we are happy, doesn't that mean we are enjoying? Or do we still enjoy it like it's secondhand enjoyment? Yeah, that's a very good question. It's not that you don't become happy, right? You when in bhakti, right? And I'm sure that's the question. You know, you get that that's definitely a goal in spiritual life. Prabhupada says chant and be happy, right? He doesn't say chant and forget your happiness, right? But the idea is that the happiness is not rooted in your own happiness. When I go to when I go to India and I visit my grandma, right? There's the standard sort of thing, like my uncles will come and they'll, like, whenever they come home, they'll buy like sweets for me, right? And I'll sit down and I'll smash out, like, all of the sweets, right? And as I smash them out, my grandma, sometimes I'll just see she'll just be having a grin, right? She's just having a great time knowing that I'm having a great time, if you get what I mean. That happiness is not rooted necessarily in her enjoying that, right? So it's not so much that we're not concerned with happiness, we're not concerned with our own enjoyment, so to speak, if that makes sense. Our joy comes from the joy that we see in pleasing Krishna, right? And then there is joy, there's the greatest joy possible. Because we know, and it's this weird sort of paradox, the happiest we are is when we're helping others, right? The happiest we are is when we're doing something for others. That's why people describe parenthood as one of the greatest joys, even though it's just like, obviously I don't know, but just from my firsthand experience of being parented, it's a lot of work, right? And yet most parents will say it's so much joy, right? There's so much happiness that's brought out of it, right? Because ultimately that's our nature, right? That's not necessarily a spiritual service, but that's often described as the closest we can get to understanding how spiritual service works, right? So in the same way that a parent isn't thinking, well, I'm going to please myself, and then therefore I'm going to take care of my kid, right? No mother looks at their kid and says, I'm going to feed you because, I want to enjoy myself today, so I'm going to feed my kid, right? They feed their kid and then they get that satisfaction and that joy. So it's like that. You get that satisfaction out of service. By the way, if anyone needs to dip, feel free to dip at 12. I'll keep answering questions, but I won't hold anyone who needs to go. Yeah, just as a little heads up. So I don't know if that sufficiently answers the question. Nandan Prabhu, you've raised your hand again.
No, Prabhu, sorry, it should be down.
Oh, okay. Vignaraj Prabhu, you've raised your hand.
So does that mean, like, in the material world, we shouldn't, because we can't really see Krishna enjoying us, so we should enjoy, we should be enjoyed by other people, so because we can see their enjoyed faces, and then, like, in this sense, in the material world, we get enjoyed by other devotees because we can actually see their enjoyment.
Yeah,
I don't know if that makes sense. And then in the material, when we go to the spiritual world, we can finally see Krishna enjoying us.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Like you answered the question by saying it. So that's why we press so much stress on serving the devotees and even serving others. It's not that we should think, oh, only Gauriya Vaishnavas get my service, but obviously we place a higher role on serving Gauriya Vaishnavas because we can understand they're so intimately connected to Krishna, right? That's why we serve the devotees, because you're right. Like I haven't seen Krishna. I technically have it as the deity in the temple, but if I'll be honest, like, I just take that on faith, right? But I haven't seen Krishna like dance and be happy by my service. I doubt he does dance and be happy by my service half the time. But I haven't seen that, right? But exactly because the devotees are so close, again, we have that understanding that the devotees, they have that intimacy with Krishna. If you please, again, coming back to the parent example, if somebody takes care of somebody's child, that person is happy, right? Because they care for that person. In the same way, the devotees are there, and Krishna cares about the devotees. So Krishna is in fact pleased when the devotees are pleased, right? Because they're his friends, they're his intimate associates, right? But because we can't see Krishna, it's both practical and philosophically valuable to serve the devotees, because we can see the devotees, right? We can see them in front of us, and we can see that they're pleased. So yeah, 100%. And that's why service attitude is so important. That's why we stress serving the devotees, because practically it's the only way we're really going to develop that service attitude, right? By serving the devotees. Not that, again, we shouldn't feel compassion to everyone, right? Once Prabhupada, he was there with some of his disciples, and they were up on the top of a temple that was being constructed, right? And at the top of the temple, there was at the top of the temple, they were looking down, they saw all the laborers working, and they were working away, and they were really struggling. And one of Srila Prabhupada's disciples, he said, you know, Srila Prabhupada, I know it's their karma, but sometimes I just feel really, really bad for them. You know, they really have to suffer in order to just make a living wage, right? And he was asking this, you know, asking Prabhupada, how do I transcend my compassion for these karmis, you know, these mundaners? And Prabhupada's response, he said, why only sometimes? You should always be feeling compassion for them, right? So just to stress that point, we stress serving the devotees because we know that that's most pleasing to Krishna, because they are Krishna's dear friends. But we should have that attitude of service and compassion and, like, you know, willingness to give to everyone. But yeah, especially the devotees. Sorry, that's a long answer to your question, but does that address it, or?
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. Are there any other questions?
There's one in the chat.
There's one in the chat. Oh, I've missed it. Jiva is described as part and parcel. What exactly does it mean? Part and parcel just means it's like a small fragment of Krishna, because Krishna is infinitely conscious. He's infinitely Satchidananda, and we are like a tiny little spark of Satchidananda. In the same way that the spark of the fire is part and parcel of the fire, right? It's a small little part of the fire, but it has all the qualities of the fire. In the same way, the jiva is part and parcel of Krishna, right? It's a tiny little spark of Satchidananda. If there's no other questions, feel free to ask a question. Otherwise, we'll wrap up for today, and then we'll address the last 2 points before beginning chapter 1. Yes, Mrugank Prabhu?
Just reflecting on your answer to Vigneraj as well. Sometimes, sorry, this is my understanding, and correct me if I am wrong here. Like, we can't see Krishna, and we take it on faith that Krishna is there in the deity, and Krishna is there in the sound of the holy name, and etc. And we know that engaging in devotional service has certain effects. So as far as we are concerned, we can't challenge Shastra and say that whatever it says, my experience doesn't validate that, because our senses are faulty. But at the same time, there's the question of where is Krishna as far as I'm concerned.
Homework.
And so if I say where is Krishna as far as I'm concerned, the only real way we can say that Krishna exists and this is for real is if we practice devotional service and we feel a sense of otherworldliness. Is that correct? Like that, the joy that comes, the detachment that comes. Is that the right way to think about it?
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll discuss that. That was on that last slide that we'll have to say for next week. We touch upon that. This is what Prabhupada says in order to fully understand the Bhagavad-Gītā. If you want, you can try and guess what I'm going to say, or I guess it's in the recording. But it says there's 3 things, there's 3 qualities of Arjuna that should make him most qualified to receive this knowledge. And one of them is that he's a devotee, right? And the reason why is because that the joy you feel in devotional service, right? It does clarify that existence. Yeah. And we feel that joy, again, by serving the devotees, right? In that service, we can feel that. But still, I think Vigneraj's point was, right now, I can't see Krishna, right? So how am I meant to get that service attitude going when I can't see him at all? And the idea is then you serve the devotees.
Thank you.
anything else, feel free to ask. Otherwise, we'll wrap up. Okay, let's wrap up then. Yeah, and again, just as a heads up, when the moment it hits 12, you're always allowed to just dip. I have no strong feelings about it because, I understand we've all got places to be. So I'll stop the recording. Okay.